The dust had become a part of her. It lived in the seams of her traveling dress, a fine gray powder that had dulled the deep blue of the wool. It coated her tongue, a gritty film that no amount of lukewarm water from the canteen could wash away. For 6 days, the stagecoach had been her world, a cramped, jostling box of wood and leather that smelled of sweat, old horses, and the faint, bitter aroma of despair from passengers who had come and gone at nameless depots. Joanna Ray Kinley, however, remained. She sat bolt upright, her spine refusing to yield to the relentless rocking, her gaze fixed on the blur of the passing landscape as it bled from the rolling grasslands of Kansas into the stark, unforgiving plains of Wyoming. She was 29 years old, an age when a woman in the year of our Lord 1878 was expected to be settled, her hands softened by domesticity, her world defined by the walls of a husband's house. Joanna's hands were calloused from work, but they were her own, and her world was now as wide and uncertain as the endless sky arching over the coach. In the small reticule on her lap, beneath a handkerchief and a few carefully saved coins, lay the reason for this desperate pilgrimage. It wasn't a thick letter, filled with promises or endearments. It was a single sheet of cheap, cream-colored paper, folded so many times the creases were as soft as cloth. She didn't need to look at it to remember the words. They were branded onto her memory, a stark and unadorned lifeline. "We've got work if you've got grit." The signature was just as blunt, Marshall Boone*. She had met the man only once, years ago, when he'd passed through Kansas on a cattle drive. He was a distant cousin of her neighbor, a tall, quiet man with eyes the color of a stormy sky, who seemed to absorb everything and say almost nothing. He had watched her mend a fence with a quiet intensity that was unnerving, unlike the appraising glances of the local bachelors who saw her as either a potential wife or a curiosity. He saw her, it seemed, as a pair of capable hands. When the whispers in her hometown had grown into a roar, when her refusal to marry Jedediah Thorne had turned from a personal decision into a public scandal, it was Marshall Boone's name she had remembered. Jedediah Thorne had been a man of considerable influence, with a soft belly and a hard, possessive smile. He owned the town's largest mercantile and half the land surrounding it. He had courted Joanna with a suffocating propriety, assuming her acceptance was a foregone conclusion. To him, she was an asset to be acquired, another fine possession. When she had looked him in the eye and said, "No, I thank you for the offer, but I will not be your wife," the shock on his face had quickly curdled into a venomous pride. The fallout was immediate and suffocating. It wasn't loud confrontations in the street. It was worse. It was the sudden silence when she entered the general store. It was the way the other women in church would form a tight circle of whispering bonnets, their glances flicking towards her like thrown stones. She was the woman who had said no, the woman who thought herself too good for a man like Jedediah Thorne. Whispers slithered through the town she was proud, difficult, unnatural, a woman her age, with no prospects to speak of, turning down such a match. There had to be something wrong with her, something broken. Her own mother had wept, not for her daughter's happiness, but for the shame she had brought upon the family name. What will people say? Joanna, she had cried, as if the opinions of gossips were more important than the truth of her daughter's heart. Joanna had borne it for 3 months, her silence a shield. But the air in Kansas had become too thin to breathe, so she had penned a letter, her handwriting tight and controlled, to the one man she could think of who lived beyond the reach of Jedediah Thorne's wounded pride. She didn't ask for charity. She asked for work. His reply, which took weeks to arrive, contained no salutation and no pleasantries, just those 9 stark words. They were a challenge, not a welcome, and in that challenge, Joanna had found a sliver of hope. Grit. It was a word as rough and real as the land she was now traveling through. She had it. She had to. It was all she had left. The coach lurched violently, throwing her against the worn leather seat. Outside, The world was a study in brown and pale green. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, beating down on the cracked earth. She closed her eyes, the image of Marshall Boone's letter a comforting darkness behind her lids. It was a promise of something honest. Wyoming wasn't a place for polite fictions or veiled insults. It was a place, she imagined, where a person was judged by what they could do, not by who they had refused to marry. Finally, late in the afternoon, the driver's gruff voice cut through the monotonous rumble. "Dry Creek." Joanna straightened, pulling her bonnet forward and smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt, a futile gesture. She peered out the small, dust-caked window. The town, if one could call it that, was little more than a single, wide street carved from the dirt. A handful of unpainted, false-fronted buildings stood hunched against the wind, a saloon with swinging doors, a livery, a mercantile, and a few other nondescript structures. There were no trees to soften the harsh lines, no gardens to offer a splash of color. Everything was the color of dust and faded timber. It was a place built for necessity, not for comfort. The coach groaned to a halt in front of the mercantile, the horses snorting and stamping, their hides slick with sweat. The door was pulled open, and the driver grunted. "End of the line, ma'am." Joanna gathered her small bag and her reticule, her movements deliberate and stiff after the long journey. She stepped down onto the hard-packed earth, her legs unsteady beneath her. The air was thin and dry, carrying the scent of dust, manure, and pine from some distant, unseen mountains. The silence was profound, broken only by the jingle of harnesses and the restless shuffling of the horses. She stood alone, a solitary figure in a dark blue dress, feeling the vastness of the sky pressed down on her. She had held a small, secret hope that Mr. Boone might be there to meet her. A simple nod of acknowledgement would have been enough, but the street was nearly empty. No one was waiting. The weight of her isolation settled upon her, heavier than her travel fatigue. She had crossed half a continent to arrive at this desolate outpost, propelled by a 9-word letter, and her arrival was met with complete indifference. She took a deep breath, forcing the tremor in her hands to still. She was not the wilting flower the women of Kansas thought her to be. She was Joanna Ray Kinley. She had grit. A figure detached itself from the shadows of the mercantile's porch. He had been leaning against a support beam, half hidden, watching. He was a man of indeterminate age, his face a roadmap of sun and wind, his clothes stained and worn. He leisurely pushed himself upright, his movements slow and deliberate. He had a wad of tobacco tucked in his cheek, and as he approached, he turned his head and spat a stream of dark brown juice into the dust near her boots. Joanna did not flinch. She met his gaze directly. His eyes were small and shrewd, taking in every detail of her appearance, her height, which was considerable for a woman, the quality of her dress, the exhaustion etched around her eyes. He stopped a few feet from her, hooking his thumbs into his suspenders. He chewed for a moment, his jaw working methodically. "You're the tall gal." "Huh," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a label, pinning her down and defining her in this new place before she had even spoken a word. It was blunt, devoid of courtesy, and in its own way, just as judging as the whispers she had fled. Here, the judgment was just out in the open, as stark and unadorned as the landscape itself. Joanna lifted her chin, the dust of Wyoming on her face feeling less like a stain and more like a baptism. "I am Joanna Kinley," she replied, her voice clearer and stronger than she expected. "I'm here to see a Mr. Boone." The man called Clem gave a non-committal grunt, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer before dismissing her entirely. He gestured with his head toward the far end of the street. "Livery. Boone's in there." Then he turned and sauntered back to his spot on the porch, his duty done. Joanna squared her shoulders and began to walk. Each step felt deliberate, a claim on this new, uncertain ground. The dust of Dry Creek puffed up around the hem of her dress, a fine, reddish powder that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth. The street was wider than any in her Kansas town, built to accommodate the great, lumbering freight wagons and sprawling herds of cattle that were the lifeblood of this territory. The buildings, weathered to a uniform silver gray, seemed to lean into the wind, their facades like tired, stoic faces. A few men stopped what they were doing to watch her pass a blacksmith leaning in the gaping maw of his workshop. 2 cowhands idling outside the saloon. Their gazes were not the veiled, sanctimonious looks of the women in Kansas. They were open, direct, and assessing, measuring her as they would a stray horse that had wandered into town. She felt like a foreign creature, a long-legged bird blown far from its migratory path. She did not lower her eyes. The livery smelled of hay, horsehide, and honest sweat. It was a vast, cavernous space, with shafts of late-afternoon sun cutting through the dusty air, illuminating the dancing motes like tiny, golden insects. Horses shifted and nickered in their stalls, the sound a soft, constant music. In the center of the barn, a man stood with his back to her, his attention focused on a length of leather harness draped over a saddler's horse. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed, a fact that gave her a small, irrational sense of relief. She had always been tall for a woman, a feature often remarked upon with a note of disapproval, as if her very stature were an act of defiance. This man would not have to look up to meet her eyes. He wore plain, durable trousers tucked into worn leather boots, and a faded blue work shirt that was stretched taut across a broad back and shoulders. The sleeves were rolled up to his forearms, revealing arms corded with muscle and tanned to the color of dark honey. He moved with an economy of motion, his hands working a tool over the leather with a slow, practiced confidence. She stopped a respectful distance away, her bag suddenly feeling heavy in her hand. She cleared her throat, a small, uncertain sound in the vastness of the livery. Mr. Boone. He didn't startle. He simply finished the motion he was making, set his tool down with a quiet click, and turned. And there he was, Marshall Boone. He was exactly as she remembered him from years ago, only more so. The sun and wind had carved finer lines around his eyes and mouth, and his skin was drawn tight over the hard planes of his face. His hair was the color of dark, wet sand, and his eyes, as they settled on her, were the color of a sky threatening a storm, a deep, complex gray that held no warmth, but a startling clarity. He looked at her, and the world seemed to fall silent. Joanna had spent the last several months being looked asterisk at asterisk. She had been examined, dissected, and judged by the eyes of her community. Jedediah Thorne had looked at her with the pride of a collector appraising a new acquisition. The women of the town had looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. The men on the street of Dry Creek had looked at her with frank, animal curiosity. Marshall Boone's gaze was none of those things. He looked at her as a man might look at a hawk circling overhead, or a line of thunderheads massing on the horizon. There was no judgment in his eyes, no approval or disapproval. There was only a profound, unnerving stillness, a deep and quiet observation. He was not seeing a runaway spinster, a social pariah, or even a woman. He was seeing an event, a set of circumstances that had arrived in his livery, and which needed to be carefully and thoroughly understood before any action was taken. For the first time in a very long time, Joanna felt seen not for what she represented, but simply for what she was, a reality standing before him. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Miss Kinley." His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges, a voice more accustomed to the open air than to parlors. "Mr. Boone," she replied, her own voice steady. "Thank you for your letter. I came as soon as I was able." He did not waste time with pleasantries. He did not ask if her journey was difficult. He did not ask why a woman of her apparent breeding had left her home in Kansas to seek work in the wilds of Wyoming. He did not ask about the whispers, the scandal, the man she had refused. His silence on these matters was a gift, a clean, empty space where she could begin to build a new life without the baggage of the old one. He simply accepted her presence as a fact and moved on to the next practical consideration. His eyes flicked from her face, down the length of her dusty traveling dress, to her sturdy but scuffed boots, and back to her eyes. "You know how to ride?" The question was direct, the only one that mattered. It was about what she could do. A wave of shame, hot and swift, washed over her. She had been raised to pour tea, to embroider, to manage a household. Riding was a skill for men, or for girls far wilder than she had ever been allowed to be. "Not well," she admitted, the words feeling like a confession of a deeper inadequacy. In this land, not being able to ride was like not being able to walk. He considered her answer for a long moment. She braced herself for the dismissal, the quiet pronouncement that he had made a mistake, that there was no place for her here. Instead, he gave that same slow nod. "Then I'll teach you." The 3 words landed in the quiet space between them with the weight of a solemn vow. It wasn't an offer of kindness. It was a statement of intent. He saw a problem, and he named the solution. He would make her useful. He would give her the skills she needed to survive here. The simple, practical promise was more comforting than any words of sympathy could ever have been. It was a promise of inclusion. He turned and picked up her bag as if it weighed nothing. "This all you got?" "Yes." "Come on, then." He led her out of the livery and toward a sturdy buckboard wagon hitched to a single, patient mare. He tossed her bag into the back and then turned to help her up. His hand was hard and calloused against hers, his grip firm and impersonal. He moved to the driver's seat, and with a click of the reins, they were moving, leaving the small, dusty street of Dry Creek behind. They rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding hoofbeats of the mare. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the vast, empty landscape in hues of orange and deep purple. Before them, rising from the plains, was a great, flat-topped mountain of red rock that seemed to burn in the failing light. Red Mesa. As they drew closer, she could see the ranch nestled at its base, not a single, grand house, but a collection of low, rugged buildings, a long bunkhouse, a cook shack with a curl of smoke rising from its chimney, and a sprawling network of corrals. It was a place of work, stark and functional. Boone didn't take her to what looked like the main house. He guided the wagon toward the long, low bunkhouse. As they approached, the door opened, and a few men spilled out, drawn by the sound of the wagon. They were a rough-hewn lot, their faces bearded and weathered, their clothes practical and patched. They stopped when they saw Joanna, their conversations dying in their throats. Again, she felt the weight of their collective gaze. It was the look of men whose world was simple, ordered, and almost entirely female-free. Her arrival was a disruption, a question mark placed in the middle of their lives. They stared with an open, unapologetic curiosity, their eyes taking in the strange sight of a tall, well-dressed woman sitting beside their boss. Boone brought the wagon to a halt and swung down. He ignored the other men completely, his focus entirely on the task at hand. He gestured to a small, separate cabin set a little ways off from the main bunkhouse. It was little more than a shed, built of the same rough-sawn pine as the other buildings. "That'll be yours," he said. He retrieved her bag from the wagon, carried it to the door of the small cabin, and set it down on the porch. He didn't wait for a thank you. He turned back to her. "Cook fires at 6, he stated. "You'll take your meals with the rest." With that, he turned and strode back toward the corrals, his long, confident strides eating up the ground. He was already moving on to the next chore, her arrival and settlement now a completed task. Joanna stood for a moment, watching him go. Then she turned and pushed open the door to her new home. It was a single small room, clean but bare. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, a small, rough table and a single chair against the other. A small window looked out over the darkening plains. As she stepped inside, a gust of wind rattled the window in its frame, a cold draft whispering through a crack in the wood. It was a lonely, desolate sound. She placed her hand on the rough, unpainted wall. It was not the life she had ever imagined, but it was a life, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was her own. The first few weeks at the Red Mesa Ranch passed in a rhythm of work and silence. Joanna learned the names of the men not through formal introductions, but by overhearing them as they worked a grizzled, one-eyed cook named Patch, a wiry wrangler with a quick smile named Silas, and a boy barely out of his teens called Billy, whose face was a constellation of freckles. They were a closed circle, their lives dictated by the sun and the needs of the cattle. They treated her with a wary, hands-off respect, speaking to her only when necessary, their words clipped and practical. She was a presence, an anomaly, and they seemed to be waiting, as Marshall Boone was, to see what she would become. Her days were spent in the cook shack, a long, low building that always smelled of wood smoke and stale coffee. She scrubbed pots until her knuckles were raw, swept the rough-hewn floorboards, and learned from Patch the simple, hearty meals that fueled the men. She was a quiet shadow, her movements efficient, her head bowed over her work. She did not offer unsolicited conversation, and she did not complain. This was the first part of the bargain work. The second part, grit, was tested not at the ranch, but in the town of Dry Creek. After 2 weeks, their supply of flour ran low. Boone approached her after the morning meal, his shadow falling over the table she was wiping down. "We need supplies from the mercantile," he said, not asking, but stating a fact. "Silas will drive you in." A knot tightened in Joanna's stomach, but she simply nodded. "I'll make a list." The wagon ride into Dry Creek was as silent as her first journey from it. Silas kept his eyes on the horizon, the brim of his hat pulled low. The town, when they arrived, seemed unchanged, a single dusty street baking under the relentless Wyoming sun. But this time, Joanna was not a stranger. This time, she was a story. She could feel it the moment she stepped onto the porch of the mercantile. Inside, 3 women were gathered near a bolt of calico fabric, their heads close together in quiet conversation. One was the blacksmith's wife, a stout woman named Mrs. Gable, whose word, Joanna intuited, carried the weight of law in the town's small female society. As the bell above the door chimed, their conversation stopped abruptly. 3 pairs of eyes turned to her, and a silence as cold and sudden as a winter frost fell over the store. Joanna walked past them to the counter, her back straight, feeling the full force of their stares. They were not merely looking, they were cataloging. Her height, the plainness of her work dress, the way she carried herself with a stillness that they mistook for arrogance. In their world, a woman alone was a tragedy or a disgrace. Since Joanna did not appear tragic, they had settled on disgrace. She handed her list to the proprietor, a balding man who avoided her gaze. As he began to measure out flour and beans, the women resumed their conversation, their voices now pitched to a low, carrying whisper, designed to be overheard. "From Kansas," the stage driver said, came Mrs. Gable's voice, sharp and certain. "Came all this way on her own." "I heard she was engaged to be married," another woman added, her tone laced with faint sympathy. "To a very important man. Owned half the county, they say." "And she just ran," the third voice whispered, a note of delicious horror in it. "Left him standing at the altar. Can you imagine the scandal?" Mrs. Gable made a small, dismissive sound. "Look at her, tall as a man and twice as proud. It's no wonder he couldn't handle her. Some women are just born to be thorns in a man's side." Joanna stood perfectly still, her hands resting on the rough wood of the counter. Each word was a tiny, sharp stone, and she could feel them pelting her. It was Kansas all over again. The same whispers, the same judgments, carried 1,000 miles on the wind. For a wild, desperate moment, she wanted to turn, to face them, to tell them they knew nothing of her life, nothing of the suffocating pressure of a loveless future, nothing of the courage it took to say no. But she didn't. She had learned in Kansas that to fight gossip was to feed it. Silence was her only shield. She paid for her goods, her movements unhurried, gathered her sacks, and walked out of the store without a backward glance. But the silence she projected outward was a roaring tempest inside her, the hope she had nurtured that here, in this vast, empty land, she could be judged on her own terms, withered and died in the dry. Gossiping heat of the mercantile. Back at the ranch, she retreated further into her shell of quiet usefulness. She saw the way the men's clothes were often torn by sharp branches or barbed wire, their mending a clumsy patchwork of thick, uneven stitches. One evening, she saw young Billy squinting in the lantern light, trying to force a thick thread through a tear in his shirt sleeve. Without a word, Joanna took a small sewing kit from her bag, one of the few personal items she possessed, and approached him. "Here," she said softly. He looked up, startled, his face flushing. "Ma'am, I can—" "It's no trouble," she insisted, taking the shirt from his hands. She sat by the fire, her needle flashing in the flickering light. Her stitches were small, neat, and strong, a skill her mother had insisted upon for embroidering delicate pillowcases, now repurposed to mend the rough work shirt of a teenage cowboy. When she was finished, the seam was nearly invisible. She handed it back to him. He stared at the repair, a look of awe on his face. "Thank you, ma'am," he mumbled, his gratitude thick and genuine. "Thank you." After that, a small pile of torn shirts, ripped trousers, and detached buttons began to appear on the porch of her cabin each morning. She mended them all, the simple, repetitive act a balm to her troubled mind. It was a language the men understood. They didn't speak of it, but their nods became friendlier, their glances less wary. They started leaving a bucket of fresh water outside her door each day. And Silas once left a small, perfect fossil he'd found by the creek bed on her windowsill. They were small gestures of acceptance, earned not through conversation, but through the undeniable evidence of her worth. She found her place in the cook shack, too. Patch's idea of bread was a dense, leaden lump of flour and water that the men called sinkers. Joanna, remembering the light, airy loaves her grandmother used to bake, took over the task. She rose before the sun, her hands working the dough, finding a deep satisfaction in the physical act of kneading, of transforming simple ingredients into something warm and life-giving. The first time the scent of real, yeast-risen bread filled the camp, the men fell silent as they ate, a look of profound, almost reverent pleasure on their faces. No one said much, but when she brought out a second loaf, it vanished in minutes. Marshall Boone observed it all. He never praised her mending or her bread. He never commented on her quiet industry, but she would feel his eyes on her sometimes as she worked, his gaze as steady and unreadable as ever. His silence was different from the men's. Theirs was born of awkwardness. His was a conscious choice. He was watching, still observing the event, letting her find her own footing in this rough, unforgiving world. But her truest solace came at the end of each day, as the sun began its slow descent, bleeding crimson and gold across the sky and setting the face of the red mesa ablaze. She would pull a shawl around her shoulders and walk to the fence of the largest corral. There she would stand, a solitary figure in the vast landscape, and wait. Soon, she would hear it, a low rumble in the distance, a sound that vibrated through the soles of her boots. It grew into the thunder of 100 hooves, and then they would appear over the rise, the ranch's herd of horses, driven in from the pasture for the night. They were a magnificent, rushing river of life, their manes and tails flying, their bodies sleek with sweat and dust, their breath misting in the cooling air. They moved with a wild, untamed freedom that spoke to a deep and lonely place in her own heart. She would stand there until the last horse was through the gate, until the dust had settled and the sky had deepened to the color of a bruise. In those moments, the whispers of the town faded away. The loneliness she felt was no longer a wound, but a clean, quiet space. The horses didn't judge her. The vast, indifferent beauty of the land didn't care about her past. Here, watching the day die over the mesa, she was not the woman who ran, or the woman who was too tall or too proud. She was just a woman, weathered but still standing, breathing in the cold, clean air of Wyoming, and for now, that was enough. The seasons turned with a brutal swiftness in Wyoming. 1 week, the air was crisp with the scent of autumn decay. The next, the world was scoured clean by an Arctic wind that swept down from the mountains, carrying the first snow on its breath. It came in the night, a silent, determined siege that buried the red dust under a blanket of pristine white. For 3 days, the men of the Red Mesa Ranch were confined to the bunkhouse, the world shrinking to the space between the corrals and the cook shack. To Joanna, the snow was both beautiful and suffocating. It amplified the silence, muffling the familiar sounds of the ranch and deepening her sense of isolation in her small, drafty cabin. She spent her days mending, baking, and watching the white flakes drift past her window, each one a tiny, perfect star of ice. The world beyond her 4 walls felt 1,000 miles away. On the 3rd night, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. A full moon rose in a sky of polished obsidian, and its light reflected off the snow with a brilliance that was almost as bright as day. The landscape was a stark etching of black and silver, beautiful and mercilessly cold. Joanna sat on her cot, a thick wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the profound silence. That's when the knock came. It wasn't a timid rap. It was a hard, urgent summons on the rough wood of her door. Her heart leapt into her throat. No one ever came to her cabin, especially not after dark. She rose, her hands trembling slightly, and pulled the door open just a crack. Marshall Boone stood on her small porch, a dark, towering silhouette against the luminous snow. His breath plumed in a white cloud before him, and the brim of his hat was dusted with frost. He didn't waste a moment on greeting. His voice was flat, stripped of all emotion by the biting cold and the urgency of his purpose. "One of the colts broke loose," he said. "A yearling, slipped the fence in the storm. I need another hand. I need another hand." The words echoed in the frozen air. He wasn't asking for the woman who baked bread or the woman who mended shirts. He was calling for a hand, a partner in work. It was the summons she had been waiting for without even knowing it. All the riding lessons he had given her over the past months, the patient instruction, the gruff commands to keep your heels down and feel the horse, don't fight it, had been leading to this. "I'll get my coat," she said, her voice steady. She moved quickly, her fingers clumsy with cold and adrenaline. She pulled on the thick woolen trousers and the heavy sheepskin-lined coat that one of the men had outgrown and left for her. They were bulky and smelled faintly of horse and wood smoke, but they were a shield against the biting cold. When she stepped back outside, Boone had 2 horses waiting, their breath smoking in the moonlight. They stood saddled and ready, their dark hides stark against the snow. He gestured to one of them, a calm, sturdy-looking mare. "This is steady. She knows the snow. Just give her head if the drifts get deep." He swung up into his own saddle with a fluid, powerful motion. Joanna, her heart pounding, mounted steady, her movements slower, more deliberate. The lessons came back to her, and she settled into the cold leather, her hands firm on the reins. Without another word, Boone turned his horse and rode out, and she followed him into the vast, silent, silver world. The cold was a physical thing, a presence that pressed in on all sides. It stung her cheeks and burned in her lungs, but there was a wild, exhilarating beauty to it all. They moved through a landscape of dreams. The only sound, the rhythmic crunch of their horses' hooves in the dry, crystalline snow. The moon cast long, sharp shadows that slid alongside them like silent companions. The red mesa was a dark, sleeping giant to their left, its features softened by its white mantle. Boone rode ahead, his broad back a reassuring presence. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who was utterly at home in this harsh wilderness. He knew the land, reading the subtle dips and rises, the places where the snow might conceal a treacherous hole or a patch of ice. Joanna focused on following his path, her body moving in rhythm with her horse, her entire being concentrated on this single, vital task. The whispers of Kansas, the stares of the townswomen, her own gnawing loneliness, it all fell away, burned off by the searing cold and the intensity of the moment. Out here, there was only the snow, the moon, and the man she was following. After an hour, he reined in his horse at the edge of a small, wind-swept ridge overlooking a shallow draw. The wind was stronger here, a relentless, cutting force that whipped tiny ice crystals against their faces. He dismounted and began to scan the valley below. His eyes narrowed. As he turned, the wind caught the collar of his coat, revealing a long, dark tear in the fabric where it had clearly snagged on a branch. "Your coat is torn," Joanna said, her words snatched away by the wind. He glanced down at it, an expression of minor annoyance on his face. "It'll hold." "It won't," she countered, swinging down from steady. "The wind will worry it until it's twice as big. You'll freeze." She walked over to him, pulling a small roll of thread and a needle from the pocket of her coat, a habit born from a lifetime of mending. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice surprisingly firm. He looked down at her, a flicker of surprise in his gray eyes, but he stood motionless as a statue. The wind howled around them, forcing her to stand close, her shoulder almost brushing his chest. Her fingers were numb, clumsy with cold, and she fumbled with the needle. He stood patient, his gaze fixed on the horizon, but she could feel the rigid stillness of his body. She began to stitch the thick fabric, her movements small and precise, the needle a tiny silver dart in the moonlight. The world shrank to this small, shared space, an island of quiet industry in the midst of the vast, howling wilderness. His scent filled her senses, cold air, leather, horse, and something else, something uniquely his, like pine and clean earth. As she finished the last stitch and snipped the thread with her teeth, her cold, bare fingers brushed against the back of his hand, which rested on his saddle horn. His skin was warm, a startling, living heat against the frozen tips of her fingers. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. She froze, expecting him to pull away, to recoil from the accidental intimacy. He didn't move. He did not flinch. He did not shift. He did not acknowledge the touch in any way. Yet his stillness was more profound than any action. He simply allowed her touch, accepting it as a natural part of the moment. Her breath caught in her throat. In his simple refusal to pull back, he had given her something she didn't know she needed, a moment of contact without consequence, a touch that was accepted without question. She finally pulled her hand away, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It's done," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. He looked down at the neat, strong seam. Then his eyes met hers. He gave a single, curt nod and swung back into his saddle. They found the colt a half-hour later, huddled in the lee of a rocky outcropping, shivering and frightened but unharmed, working together in the silent, efficient language of shared purpose. They managed to calm it and get a rope on it. The ride back was slow, the weary colt trailing behind them. When they finally reached the warm, yellow glow of the ranch buildings, the moon was low in the sky. After securing the colt in a warm stall with its mother, they stood for a moment in the quiet of the livery. the scent of hay and horses a comforting balm after the harshness of the open range. Joanna was exhausted, her body aching with a cold that felt bone deep, but she had never felt more alive. Marshall turned to her. The hard, urgent lines on his face had softened in the lantern light. He looked at her, and this time, it was not his usual, assessing gaze. He looked at her for a long, long time, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something new: respect, admiration, and something deeper, something warmer that she couldn't dare to name. It was as if the night had stripped away a layer of his reserve, leaving a glimpse of the man beneath. Then, true to his nature, the moment passed. He broke the gaze, turning to hang a bridle on its peg. The silence stretched, and she thought that would be the end of it. But then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "You rode better than most." Coming from him, a man who measured words like a miser measured gold. It was a more profound compliment than a dozen flowery speeches. It was an acknowledgement of her journey, of her transformation. It was praise for her grit. And for the first time since she had set foot in Wyoming, a slow, genuine smile spread across Joanna Ray Kinley's face. It was a small, quiet thing, a warmth that started deep inside her and rose to thaw the weariness from her expression. It was a smile that belonged only to her, born of the cold, the moon, and the silent approval of a man who had asked for a hand and found one. The night of the snow ride changed things. It was a shift not of the earth, but of the atmosphere between people. A subtle change in pressure that alters the weather of their days. In the weeks that followed, as winter locked its teeth into the high plains, Joanna felt the change in the way the men spoke to her. The wary deference was gone, replaced by an easy, casual respect. They would ask her opinion on a horse that seemed off its feed, or complain to her about the endless cold with the familiar grumble of comrades sharing a hardship. She was no longer just the woman who worked in the cook shack. She was Joanna, who had ridden out into a moonlit blizzard with the boss and come back. She had passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. The most profound change, however, was in the silence she shared with Marshall Boone. Before, his silence had been a space of observation, a neutral ground where he assessed her. Now, it was a space of communion. A shared knowledge lay between them, forged in the frozen wind and the quiet teamwork of that night. When their eyes met across the long table in the cook shack or over the top rail of a corral, there was a current of understanding that ran deeper than words. He still watched her, but his gaze was no longer just that of an employer. It was the gaze of a man who had seen her tested and had not found her wanting. This new, unspoken reality gave her a quiet courage, a question that had taken root in her heart months ago, a question she had been too afraid to ask, now felt not only possible, but necessary. The opportunity came on a particularly bitter night. The wind, a living thing, screamed around the corners of the buildings, and fine, powdery snow hissed against the window panes. The men, their bellies full of the thick beef stew she had made, had retreated to the relative warmth of the bunkhouse early. Only Patch, the old cook, remained, humming tunelessly as he sharpened a set of knives by the hearth. Joanna was tidying up, wiping down the last of the tables, when Marshall Boone came in, shaking the snow from his hat. He didn't come for food. He carried a broken headstall in his hand and settled on a low stool near the great stone fireplace, the leather and his tools spread on the floor beside him. Patch gave him a nod, finished his work with a final, satisfying scrape of steel on stone, and shuffled off to his own small room at the back of the cook shack, leaving Joanna and Marshall alone. The only sounds were the howl of the wind outside and the intimate crackle and pop of the fire within. The flames cast a warm, dancing light that painted the rough log walls in shades of orange and gold, making the room a sanctuary against the wild, frozen world. Joanna finished her work and, instead of retreating to her own cold cabin, she poured 2 mugs of coffee, the last from the pot. She placed one on the floor beside him and cradled the other in her hands, sinking onto a bench on the opposite side of the hearth. He glanced up at the mug, then at her, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. He went back to his work, his hands strong and sure as he began weaving a new leather thong through the bridle. They sat in a long, comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between two people who have no need to fill the space with noise. The heat from the fire soaked into Joanna's weary bones, and the warmth of the coffee mug seeped into her palms in this small, firelit space, with a storm raging outside. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. It was this peace that finally gave her the strength. She watched the firelight play over the hard, quiet lines of his face. He was a man made of the same stark, durable material as the land itself. She thought of his letter, the 9 words that had been her only compass. She thought of his lessons, his patience. She thought of the night in the snow, the steady, warm weight of his hand beneath her fingers. "Why'd you let me stay?" The question was so quiet. It was almost stolen by the wind moaning in the chimney. He didn't stop his work. His hands continued their steady, rhythmic task, but she saw them pause for a fraction of a second before resuming. He seemed to be considering the question, or perhaps considering the truest way to answer it. He worked the leather for another full minute, the silence stretching until Joanna began to think he hadn't heard her, or had chosen to ignore her. Her cheeks grew hot with a familiar flush of shame. She had overstepped. Then he set the bridle down and looked directly into the flames, his profile etched by the light. 'Cause I've seen storms before," he said, his voice a low rumble, deeper than the wind. He was silent for another moment. Then he turned his head, and his gray eyes, clear and serious in the firelight, met hers. You're weathered, but still standing." The words settled over her not like a compliment, but like a truth she had never allowed herself to believe. He wasn't talking about the snowstorm. He was talking about Kansas. He was talking about Jedediah Thorne, about the whispers, about the suffocating judgment of a world that had tried to break her. He saw it all, not as a stain on her character, but as a storm she had endured. Weathered asterisk. The word was perfect. It spoke of hardship, of being worn down by the elements, of being scarred, but it also spoke of survival. An old, gnarled tree on a windswept ridge was weathered. A rock smoothed by a relentless river was weathered, and she, Joanna Ray Kinley, was still standing. He didn't see her as ruined. He didn't see her as a runaway or a spinster. He saw her as a survivor. A profound, aching warmth spread through her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the warmth of being seen, of being understood in a way that no one, not even she herself, had managed before. Tears pricked the back of her eyes, but she would not let them fall. The silence that followed his words was different. It was no longer just comfortable. It was charged, thick with unspoken emotion. The space between them, across the braided rug on the floor, seemed to hum with a new energy. He had given her a gift of immense value, a new way of seeing herself, and in that moment of raw, unguarded gratitude, instinct took over. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she leaned forward, a small, unconscious closing of the distance between them. It was a slight shift of her weight, a question asked with her body instead of her voice. It was an invitation, a movement toward the warmth and safety he represented. He saw the movement. His eyes, which had been on her face, dropped for a second to her mouth and then lifted again. A muscle tightened in his jaw. The air grew thick, heavy enough to breathe. He leaned forward too, just an inch, his elbows resting on his knees. The space between them was now barely a few feet, a chasm of firelit air. She thought he might close the distance, that this might be the moment the unspoken thing between them finally found its voice. Instead, he spoke, and his voice was a whisper, so low it was almost a part of the fire's hiss. "Not tonight." The words were not harsh. They were not a rejection. They were a quiet, regretful statement of fact, delivered with an intimacy that was almost more potent than a kiss. It was a gentle hand holding her back from a ledge. He was not pushing her away. He was asking her to pause. Joanna stopped, the slight forward cant of her body freezing in place. A wave of heat washed over her, a blush of embarrassment and confusion. But beneath it, there was no sting of rejection. The way he said it, the quiet sorrow in his voice, the steadiness of his gaze told her that this was not about her. It was not about a lack of want. It was about something else, something inside him, a boundary he was holding for reasons she couldn't guess. She straightened up slowly, pulling back into her own space, and picked up her coffee mug, her hands needing something to hold on to. She stared into the fire, her mind racing. Asterisk, not tonight, asterisk. The words held a world of meaning. They were a denial, but they were also a promise. They spoke of a future, of other nights, of a time that was not now. He picked up the headstall again, his large hands once more moving with practiced ease, as if the charged moment had never happened. But it had. It hung in the air between them, a new and delicate thread woven into the fabric of their silence. She had offered, and he had gently refused. But in his refusal, he had somehow managed to pull her closer still. They sat there for another hour without speaking, two solitary figures sharing the warmth of a fire, while the winter storm raged on outside. Winter does not surrender the land easily. It retreats, then attacks again. Its final spasms a series of thaws and freezes that turn the ranch into a treacherous landscape of mud and ice. But then, a true thaw came, carried on a warm Chinook wind that swept over the plains like a promise. The snow shrank, the creeks began to run again, and the air filled with the rich, damp scent of awakening earth. The change was intoxicating, stirring a restless, fragile hope in Joanna's heart that mirrored the season. The world was opening up again, and with it, the need to reconnect with the town of Dry Creek. The ranch was low on baking yeast and salt, and with the roads now passable, Marshall tasked Joanna with making the trip. She felt a familiar knot of apprehension, but the memory of the fire-lit night, of his quiet "not tonight," was a small, warm stone in her pocket. It was a denial that had felt more like a promise, and it had given her a new, albeit tentative, sense of security. She believed she could face the town again. Dry Creek had shrugged off its winter hibernation. The main street was a river of thick, brown mud, but the boardwalks were busy. Joanna guided the wagon to the mercantile, but the yeast they had in stock was old and dead. The proprietor directed her to a new establishment that had opened during the winter months, a proper bakery, run by a widow from back east. The bakery smelled of heaven, cinnamon, melting sugar, and warm bread created a thick, sweet atmosphere that was a world away from the grit and sweat of the Red Mesa. Several of the town's women, including the formidable Mrs. Gable, were gathered around a small table, sipping coffee. Presiding over the counter was a woman in her late 30s, dressed in immaculate black bombazine, her blonde hair coiled in a severe but elegant knot. This, Joanna knew without asking, was the widow, Mrs. Miller. There was an air of crisp, sorrowful authority about her, as if her widowhood were a title that granted her special privileges of judgment. As Joanna entered, the conversation at the table faltered. Mrs. Miller looked up, her blue eyes as cool and pale as a winter sky, a flicker of something recognition, and a sharp, proprietary animosity passed over her features before being smoothed away into a mask of polite inquiry. "May I help you?" Her voice was clipped, precise. "I need a packet of fresh yeast, please," Joanna said, keeping her own voice even and calm. "Mrs." Miller turned to retrieve the yeast, her movements deliberate. As she did, her eyes met those of Mrs. Gable at the table, and a silent, significant look was exchanged. The air in the warm, sweet-smelling shop grew heavy. "You're the woman from the Red Mesa Ranch, aren't you, Mrs.?" Miller said, placing the yeast on the counter but keeping her hand on it. It wasn't a question. "Working for Marshall Boone." She said his name with a familiar, almost possessive cadence that grated on Joanna's nerves. "I am," Joanna replied simply, placing a coin on the counter. The widow ignored the coin. She leaned forward slightly, a thin, pitying smile on her lips. The women at the table had gone utterly still, their coffee cups forgotten. "It must be difficult, Mrs." Miller mused, her voice loud enough for the entire shop to hear. "Living out there with all those rough men, a woman on her own." Her eyes swept over Joanna's plain, durable dress, a silent critique of its lack of fashionable mourning or feminine frippery. "I manage," Joanna said, her spine stiffening. "Oh, I'm sure you do," the widow cooed, her sympathy as false as a lead dollar. "But a woman must be careful with her hopes, especially around men like Marshall Boone." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "My late husband, God rest his soul, knew his kind well. Rovers, men with dust in their blood. They'll stay for a season, maybe even a winter, but their hearts are always fixed on the horizon." A cold dread began to seep into Joanna's bones. She knew where this was going. This was not a warning. It was a public execution of her quiet, fragile hope. "Mrs." Miller picked up Joanna's coin, her smile tightening. "Don't mistake a shared winter for a promise of spring. My dear, Boone's kind doesn't settle. He's a rover, heart and soul. He'll ride out like the rest, once he's tired of the scenery." The final phrase, asterisk, tired of the scenery, asterisk, was a direct, poisoned dart, aimed straight at Joanna's heart. It reduced her to a temporary feature of the landscape, a diversion to be enjoyed and then abandoned. The other women watched, their faces a mixture of avid curiosity and smug agreement. They were witnessing the takedown of the outsider, the proud, tall woman who didn't fit, and they were savoring every moment. For a heartbeat, the floor seemed to drop out from under Joanna. The widow's words echoed the deepest, most secret fears that haunted her in the lonely hours of the night. Was she a fool? Was she mistaking common decency for affection, a moment of warmth for a lifetime of it? The air in the bakery felt thick and cloying, and she wanted nothing more than to flee. But then something else rose up in her. It was the same core of steel that had allowed her to say no to Jedediah Thorne, the same stubborn pride that had carried her across 1,000 miles of hostile country. She would not break, not here, not in front of them. She looked directly at the widow Miller, whose face was flushed with triumph. Joanna gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if considering the woman's words and finding them plausible. "Then I'll ride farther," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the sweet, thick air of the bakery with the clean, cold authority of a razor. It was an answer so unexpected, so completely outside the framework of their understanding, that it stunned them into a collective silence. They saw the world as a place where women waited, where their lives were defined by the men who stayed or left. Joanna's reply declared her a traveler in her own right, not a destination for someone else. The triumphant smirk vanished from Mrs. Miller's face, replaced by a baffled frown. Before the widow could gather her wits for another volley, Joanna took her yeast, turned her back on the silent, staring women, and walked out of the bakery, her head held high. The moment the door closed behind her, however, the trembling started. It began in her hands and spread through her entire body. Her defiant words echoed in her ears, but they felt like a boast, a lie she had told to save her pride. She fumbled with the wagon ties, her fingers refusing to obey. She climbed into the seat, her composure shattering like a thin pane of ice. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of muddy road and raw, wounded sky. The widow's words played over and over in her mind. He'll ride out like the rest, tired of the scenery. Was she waiting for something that would never, ever come? Marshall was a good man, a quiet man. He was kind in his own rough, practical way. But kindness was not love. A shared sense of duty was not a shared life. His "not tonight" had felt like a promise. But what if it was simply a gentle, permanent refusal? A way of letting her down without wounding her pride. He was a man of the open range. He had the horizon in his eyes. How could she, a woman from a settled Kansas town, ever hope to be more than a temporary harbor in his long, solitary journey? The farther she rode, the more her brave words felt like the desperate bravado of a fool. By the time she reached the Red Mesa, she was hollowed out, the warmth of the spring thaw replaced by a deep, internal chill. She unhitched the wagon, her movements mechanical, and walked the final, weary steps to her cabin, her heart as heavy as a stone. And there, on the top step of her porch, was a small, neatly wrapped parcel. She stopped, her brow furrowing. It was wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with a bit of twine. There was no name, no note. She picked it up. It was soft, yielding, with numb fingers. She untied the twine and unfolded the paper. Inside lay a pair of work gloves. They were not fancy. They were made of a soft, supple deerskin, the color of rich cream. They were beautifully made, with strong, even stitching along the seams. They were clearly a man's gloves in their sturdy construction, but they were sized for a woman's hands. For her hands. She stared at them, her throat tightening. She thought of her own hands, chapped and reddened by lye soap, cold water, and the harsh Wyoming wind. She had never complained, but he had noticed. In his silent way, he had seen her small, daily struggle, and he had provided a solution. There was no card, no grand declaration. There didn't need to be. The gloves were a message in his own language, practical, solid, and deeply caring. It was a gesture that said, "Asterisk, I see you. I see your work. I want to protect you." Slowly, she slipped her right hand into one of the gloves. It fit perfectly, the soft leather molding to her skin as if it were made for her. The trembling in her hand stopped. The widow's cruel, public words faded, replaced by this quiet, private act of kindness. The gloves did not promise he would stay forever. They did not speak of love or marriage or settling down. But they spoke of asterisk now, asterisk. They were a tangible link to him, a silent counter-argument to her fears. They were the answer of a man who dealt not in pretty words, but in solid, dependable deeds. And holding them, Joanna felt the ground beneath her feet become solid again. He might be a rover, but he was here now, and he had noticed her hands. The deerskin gloves were a second skin, a silent, daily reminder of a conversation that had happened without words. As Joanna worked, the soft leather protected her from the splinters in the firewood and the bite of the lingering cold, and with every movement, she felt the echo of his quiet care. A fragile peace had settled over the Red Mesa ranch, the kind of deep, weary tranquility that follows a hard winter. The days grew longer, the mud began to dry, and the men's laughter came more easily as they went about the business of a ranch awakening to spring. The evening was calm, the sky a placid, fading blue. Joanna was in the cook shack, the scent of fresh bread once again filling the warm air, a comforting anchor to the day. Outside, the low murmur of the men's voices drifted from the bunkhouse, where a desultory card game was underway. Marshall was in the livery, his preferred place of solitude, likely mending tack by the light of a single lantern. It was a picture of perfect, hard-won domesticity. The peace was shattered not by a sound, but by a feeling, a sudden, unnatural tension in the air. The horses in the nearest corral, usually calm at this hour, began to shift and snort, their heads up, ears pricked toward the darkness that lay beyond the circle of lantern light. Then came the shout, a sharp, guttural cry of alarm from Silas. Who was on watch? It was followed instantly by the splintering crack of a fence rail and the terrifying, thunderous sound of a panicked herd. Chaos erupted. Men poured from the bunkhouse, some grabbing rifles, others just running toward the sound, their faces stark with alarm in the flickering light. Joanna's heart seized in her chest. She ran to the door of the cook shack and peered out into a nightmare of shouting men, panicked horses, and dark, fleeting shapes on horseback. Raiders. They moved with a swift, brutal efficiency. Their goal, the prime horses in the main stable. She saw Marshall, a rifle in his hand, a commanding figure in the swirling confusion. He wasn't firing wildly. He was moving with a lethal purpose, positioning himself and two other men between the thieves and the stable door, the most valuable assets on the ranch. Joanna felt a primal urge to run, to hide in her cabin and bolt the door until it was over. The world she had built, this fragile sense of safety, was being torn apart. But then she saw young Billy. He had been caught out in the open, near a smaller corral, trying to calm a frightened mare. One of the raiders, a large, bearded man, broke away from the main group, spurring his horse directly toward the boy. He wasn't trying to shoot him. He was trying to catch him, to swing him up onto his horse as a shield or a hostage. Billy scrambled backward, his face a white mask of terror. He tripped and fell. The raider was upon him, leaning down from his saddle, a thick arm outstretched. Something inside Joanna snapped. This was her home. These were her people. Billy, who looked at her mending with such awe. The men who left her fresh water. Marshall, who had seen a storm in her and not been afraid. She turned from the door and her eyes fell upon the old shotgun propped in the corner. Marshall had put it there weeks ago. "You should know how to use this," he had said, his voice matter-of-fact. He had taken her out behind the mesa, shown her how to load it, how to brace for the kick. "You don't aim to kill," he'd instructed. "You just aim to make a man change his mind about what he's doing." Her hands, now steady, reached for the heavy weapon. It felt alien and brutal in her grip. She checked the load, her movements clumsy but sure, a muscle memory from that single lesson. She ran back to the doorway, her heart a cold, heavy drum against her ribs. She raised the shotgun, the long barrel seeming to weigh 100 pounds. She rested it on the doorframe to steady her aim. She saw the raider leaning down, his hand just inches from Billy's collar. She didn't think. She just acted. She didn't aim at the man. She aimed at the dark patch of ground just in front of his horse. She closed her eyes for a split second, braced herself, and pulled the trigger. The roar was deafening, a physical blow that seemed to rip the air apart. The kick of the stock slammed into her shoulder, a brutal, shocking force that knocked her backward a step. Orange flame belched from the barrel, and the night was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The effect was instantaneous. The raider's horse, terrified by the blast that had erupted at its feet, screamed and reared violently. The man was thrown off balance, forced to haul on the reins to control his mount. The moment of advantage was lost. Billy scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing into the shadows behind the bunkhouse. The raider, cursing, fought his horse for a moment, his furious gaze sweeping the ranch and settling on the dark doorway of the cook shack. He couldn't see her clearly, but he knew where the shot had come from. The blast had changed the fight. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by a clear message this was not an easy prize. With an angry yell to his companions, he wheeled his horse around and spurred it into the darkness. A moment later, the other thieves followed, melting back into the night as quickly as they had appeared. A handful of stolen horses their only prize. Silence descended, thick and ringing. The only sounds were the nervous whickering of the remaining horses and the heavy breathing of the men. Then, the aftermath began. Men called out to each other, checking for injuries. Joanna leaned against the doorframe, the heavy shotgun suddenly impossible to hold. She let it slide to the floor, her entire body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. "Is everyone all right?" Silas yelled. "Billy, you all right, kid?" another voice called. I'm here, I'm fine. Billy's voice was shaky, but whole. Miss Kinley, she... Joanna didn't hear the rest. Her focus was on the stable, where a small group of men were gathered around a figure leaning against the wall. Marshall. She pushed herself away from the door and walked toward them on legs that felt like water. As she got closer, she saw him wave off the other men, straightening up as if by sheer force of will. But she saw the dark stain spreading on his left sleeve, just below the shoulder. It's just a graze, he was saying, his voice tight with pain he refused to acknowledge. She pushed through the small circle of men. Let me see. Her voice was quiet, but it held a new authority that no one, not even Marshall, seemed ready to question. He looked at her, his face pale and grim in the lantern light. He opened his mouth to protest, but then his eyes met hers, and he fell silent. He gave a curt nod. She led him to the cook shack, the men parting to let them through. Inside, the warm, comforting smell of bread was now mingled with the sharp tang of gunpowder. She sat him down on the bench by the fire and stoked the flames until they blazed bright, with a basin of hot water, clean cloths, and a bottle of whiskey. She set to work. She cut away the sleeve of his shirt with a pair of shears. The wound was a deep, ragged gash, bleeding freely. It wasn't a bullet graze, it was a knife wound. He must have fought one of them, hand to hand, at the stable door. He sat rigid as a statue, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on her face as she gently cleaned the wound. She worked in silence, her hands, protected by his gloves, now tending to his injury. Her focus was absolute. All the terror and chaos of the night narrowed to this single, vital task. When she was finished cleaning it, she looked up at him. This will sting. He just nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. She poured the whiskey over the wound. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, and every muscle in his body went taut, but he made no other sound. Her own hands were shaking again, but her touch remained steady as she bandaged the arm with clean strips of cloth, her stitches as neat and practical as the ones she used on torn shirts. When she was done, she gathered the bloody cloths and the basin, her movements brisk, efficient. The task was over. The intimacy of the moment was broken, and she felt a sudden need to retreat, to go back to being the quiet woman who kept to her place. You should get some rest, she said, her voice sounding formal and strange to her own ears. She turned to leave. She had taken only a single step when his right hand shot out and clamped around her wrist. It was not a brutal grip, but it was unbreakable. It was a touch of shocking, desperate strength. It stopped her cold. Slowly, she turned back to face him. He was looking at her, and the look in his eyes was one she had never seen before. The cool, observational distance was completely gone, burned away by the fire of the raid, by her courage, by his pain. In its place was something raw, unguarded, and intensely vulnerable. It was a look that held awe, gratitude, and a deep, staggering affection he could no longer conceal behind his wall of silence. His eyes held hers, and in their stormy gray depths, she saw a man who was no longer just standing beside her. He was reaching for her. His grip on her wrist lasted only a moment, but it burned a brand into her skin, a circle of heat that lingered long after he let go. He had pulled back his hand as if snatching it from a flame, the raw vulnerability in his eyes vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, shuddered once more behind his usual quiet reserve. He had mumbled a gruff, formal, "Thank you for the assistance, ma'am," and then he was gone, retreating into the darkness of the livery, leaving her standing alone in the cook shack with the scent of gunpowder and the ghost of his touch. The days that followed the raid were charged with a new, unspoken tension. The shared violence had broken something open between them, and it could not be put back. There was an awareness now, a magnetic pull that was palpable in the space they shared. The other men saw it. They gave the two of them a wide berth, their conversations sometimes faltering when Marshall's gaze would find Joanna across the corral and linger a moment too long. They saw the way his eyes would follow the deerskin gloves on her hands as she worked, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they represented. The secret was no longer a secret. It was a living, breathing thing at the heart of the Red Mesa Ranch. Life settled into a new rhythm, one defined by the steady healing of Marshall's arm and the slow, patient waiting for a conversation that never seemed to come. Winter's last breath finally gave out, and the evenings, though still cold, were no longer brutal. Spring was asserting itself in the green haze on the distant hills and the plaintive cries of newborn calves. On one such evening, a full 2 weeks after the raid, Joanna sat alone in the cook shack. The men had eaten and retired, and the long room was quiet save for the gentle hiss and crackle of a low fire in the hearth. A cold wind soughed around the eaves, a lonely sound that only amplified the warmth and peace within. In her lap lay a half-finished blanket, a patchwork of salvaged wool in shades of brown and gray and deep blue. Her knitting needles moved with a steady, rhythmic click-clack, a comforting, domestic sound that measured out the peaceful passage of time. She was weaving a life here, stitch by stitch. For the first time she could remember, she felt a sense of deep, quiet contentment. She was not waiting for anything. She was simply being. The main door opened, letting in a swirl of cold air before it was shut quietly. She didn't need to look up. She knew the solid, deliberate weight of his footsteps, the way he moved with no wasted motion. She felt his presence as a change in the very atmosphere of the room. Marshall didn't speak. He walked to the hearth, his boots silent on the stone flags, and pulled up the low stool he had sat on before. He eased himself down, his recently injured arm held carefully at his side. He stretched his long legs out toward the warmth and stared into the flames, his profile a rugged landscape of light and shadow. He just sat. The minutes stretched, marked only by the click of her needles and the soft sigh of the fire. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the memory of the last time they had sat like this, in these exact spots. It was filled with the memory of a snow ride, of a shotgun blast, of his hand on her wrist. It was a silence that held every question that had ever passed between them. Joanna's hands did not falter in their work. The wool slid smoothly through her fingers. She felt his gaze shift from the fire to her. She didn't meet it, keeping her own eyes fixed on the flames, on the hypnotic dance of the embers. She knew this was it. The moment had arrived, circling back on itself, offering a chance to say what had been left unsaid. The power, which had once been his, to set the boundaries of their encounter, now felt as if it had been passed to her. He had come to her, in silence, and he was waiting. She thought of his words from that night months ago, the gentle refusal that had somehow saved her pride, even as it had denied her hope. Asterisk, not tonight asterisk. He had said it to protect her, or himself, or the fragile thing growing between them. Now, she would say it back to him, but for a different reason entirely. She would say it to show him she had understood. Her needles stopped their clicking. The silence in the room became absolute. She took a slow breath, and the words came out on a whisper, a soft curl of sound directed not at him, but at the fire, at the space between them. Not tonight. It was not a rejection. It was an echo. It was a statement of control. A quiet declaration that she was no longer the frightened woman who had arrived in Dry Creek with nothing but a desperate letter. She was a woman who had faced down gossip and fear, who had fired a shotgun to protect her home, who had earned her place. She was a woman who now had the strength to choose her own time. He was completely still. In the corner of her vision, she could see his hands resting on his knees, his fists loosely clenched. He didn't speak for a long time. She felt a flicker of fear. Had she misread everything? Had her boldness been a terrible mistake? Then he turned his head and looked at her fully. His face was solemn, his gray eyes holding an expression of such profound, startling sincerity that it made her breath catch. He spoke, and his voice was low and certain, a vow made in the quiet of the night. Then say when. 2 words. That was all. 2 words that dismantled every wall she had ever built around her heart. It was not a question. It was not a demand. It was a surrender. He was giving her everything, the power, the choice, the future. He was telling her that he would wait, that her word was the only one that mattered, that her readiness was the key that would unlock the door between them. He was placing his heart in her hands and trusting her not to drop it. No one moved. No one touched. No one kissed. The fire crackled. The wind whispered outside. And the 2 of them sat, separated by a few feet of warm air that now shimmered with an unbearable intensity. And in the resounding silence, Joanna felt a strange, new sensation in her chest. For her entire life, her heart had been a guarded thing, a fortress besieged by expectation, by duty, by fear of judgment, by the simple, gnawing terror of being alone. It had beat a defensive, wary rhythm, always braced for the next blow. But now, in the wake of his words, the walls came down, the guards were dismissed, the gates swung open. For the very first time, her heart beat with a slow, steady, powerful rhythm, entirely without defense. It was the beat of a heart that was finally, completely, and irrevocably safe. Sleep did not come to Joanna that night. After Marshall left the cook shack, she remained by the dying fire for hours, the half-finished blanket forgotten in her lap. The 2 words he had spoken echoed in the quiet room, replaying themselves in her mind until they were no longer a question but a foundation. Asterisk. Then say when. She had spent her life reacting to her mother's expectations, to Jedediah's suffocating courtship, to the town's judgment, to the harsh demands of survival in a new land. She had been a ship tossed on a stormy sea, her course dictated by the winds of other people's wills. With those 2 words, Marshall Boone had handed her the helm. He had given her not just a choice, but the very concept of choice itself. He had made her the captain of her own fate. The weight of it was terrifying, and the lightness of it was liberating. Lying on her cot in the pre-dawn chill, she stared into the darkness and felt the last of her fear fall away. The widow Miller's bitter prophecy, her own deep-seated doubts, they were ghosts, powerless in the face of his profound and patient respect. He would not ride away. He would wait. The question was no longer asterisk if asterisk, but asterisk when asterisk. And the answer, she realized, was not something to be agonized over. It was something to be felt. It would arrive not as a thought, but as a quiet certainty, as natural and inevitable as the sunrise. She rose before the first hint of gray light touched the sky. The ranch was asleep, the bunkhouse a dark, silent shape. Instead of starting the fire in the cook shack, she pulled on her boots and the deerskin gloves he had given her, took a clean milk pail from its hook, and walked out into the vast, silent world. Her path led away from the ranch buildings, down a gentle slope into a sheltered valley where a small spring ran and the grass remained green and sweet nearly year-round. It was where they kept the milk cow, a placid animal named Daisy. The walk was a ritual she had come to cherish, a time of solitude when the world felt new and clean. This morning, it felt different. Every sensation was heightened. The cold, thin air was a balm against her sleepless skin. The scent of sagebrush and damp earth was sharper, cleaner. She watched the eastern skies shift from the deep, star-pricked indigo of late night to a soft, pearlescent gray. The world was holding its breath, waiting for the dawn, and she felt as if she were holding her breath with it. She found Daisy waiting by the milking stool, her breath a soft cloud in the cool air. Joanna sat, leaned her forehead against the cow's warm, solid flank, and began to milk. The familiar, rhythmic squeeze and pull, the steady, ringing sound of the milk hitting the bottom of the pail, were profoundly grounding. It was a rhythm of life, of sustenance, of simple, honest work. It was the rhythm of the world she had built for herself here. stitch by stitch, drop by drop. By the time the pail was full and frothy, the sky had begun to bleed with color. A thin, brilliant line of pink and orange appeared on the horizon, backlighting the stark silhouette of the distant mesas. A new day was being born. As she stood and picked up the heavy pail, a deep, unwavering calm settled over her. She had her answer. She walked back slowly, her steps sure and unhurried. She did not want to rush the moment. She watched the sun climb, its light spilling over the landscape, chasing the long, blue shadows of morning. The ranch came into view as she crested the last small rise, the raw pine of the buildings glowing warm and golden in the new light. And she saw him. He was in the center of the main yard, near the corral she had watched him mend so many times before. But today was different. He was not wearing his usual faded, patched work shirt. He was wearing a new one, a dark blue chambray, clean and crisp. Around his neck, knotted loosely, was a bandana. Not his usual dusty brown rag, but one of a deep, startling red, the color of a wild rose, of a beating heart. He was working. He had a hammer in his hand and was methodically nailing a loose board back onto the corral fence. The simple, rhythmic sound of the hammer strikes carried across the yard, asterisk, thwack, 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 asterisk. It was the sound of a man tending to his home, a man mending what was broken, a man staying. He was not looking for her, not pacing or waiting. He was simply occupying the space, his vibrant red bandana a silent, hopeful flag in the morning sun. He was making himself ready, and leaving the rest to her. She walked into the yard. The hammering stopped. He had seen her. He set the hammer down carefully on the top rail of the fence and turned, but he did not move toward her. He stood where he was, by the fence he was mending, and waited. His patience was a physical thing, a quiet, solid presence in the sunlit yard. Joanna continued her walk, her boots scuffing in the dirt. She did not go to him. She walked to the porch of the cook shack and set the milk pail down. The metal pail made a soft, definitive asterisk clank asterisk on the wooden boards. The chore was done. She straightened up, turning her body slightly toward him, and waited. Now, he moved. He pushed himself away from the corral and walked toward her. His stride was not hurried, but it was deliberate, each step closing the distance between them. He stopped a few feet away, a respectful space between them. The morning sun lit one side of his face, casting the other in shadow. His eyes, in the clear light, were the color of a calm morning sky after a storm. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound, humble respect that made her heart ache. "If today's the when," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion he did not try to hide, "I'm here." It was the most beautiful question she had ever heard, disguised as a simple statement of fact. It held no pressure, no expectation. It was an offering, pure and simple. His presence, his future, his heart laid at her feet for her to either accept or walk away from. Joanna did not answer. The words were not necessary. The time for words was over. But she did not turn away. She stood her ground, her feet planted firmly on the porch of the cook shack, in the heart of the ranch that had become her home. She met his gaze, and, in the quiet, sunlit space between them, she let her silence be her answer. The world narrowed to his face, to the earnest hope in his eyes, to the steady, unguarded beat of her own heart. The sun was on her face, warm and full of promise. The day, and the rest of her life, had begun. The day that followed was unlike any other. The sun, when it rose, seemed to cast a different quality of light, a richer gold that warmed the skin instead of just burning it. The work was the same: bread to be baked, floors to be swept, tack to be mended, but the purpose behind it felt transformed. It was no longer about survival, about earning a place. It was about building, about tending to the foundations of a life. A quiet, potent knowledge settled over the red mesa. The other men, when they came in for their morning coffee, saw it immediately. They saw it in the way Joanna moved, a new, unburdened grace in her posture. They saw it in Marshall, who, despite his usual reserved silence, seemed to occupy a larger, more settled space in the world. An unspoken question had been answered, and the entire ranch seemed to exhale in relief. Young Billy caught Joanna's eye as he took a biscuit and gave her a wide, knowing grin, which she returned with a small, shy smile of her own. There were no questions asked, no comments made. There was only a simple, communal acceptance. This was how it was meant to be. Joanna and Marshall did not speak of what had passed between them in the dawn light. There was no need. The conversation continued all day, in a language of silent glances and shared space. When she walked to the well, she was aware of him pausing in his work to watch her go. When he rode out to check the north pasture, she found her gaze lifting to the horizon, following the distant figure of the man on his horse until he was just a speck. He was a part of her landscape now, the fixed point around which her world turned. She felt a profound sense of calm, a stillness at her very center. The restless, hunted feeling that had been her companion for so long had vanished completely. In its place was a quiet, humming certainty. She thought of the women in the Dry Creek bakery, of the whispers in Kansas. Their words were like the buzzing of insignificant flies, sounds from a distant world that could no longer touch her. Her worth was not something to be debated in parlors or over coffee cups. It was here, solid and real, reflected in the steady gray eyes of a man who had asked her to say when. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the face of the mesa in fiery colors, she began her evening preparations. But tonight, they were not just chores. They were a ritual. She swept the floor of her small cabin not just to clean it, but to make it welcoming. She smoothed the simple wool blanket on her cot. She lit a single lantern, its soft, golden light pushing back the gathering shadows, creating a small, warm circle of peace. She did not put on a fancy dress. She owned none. She did not braid her hair in an elaborate style or pinch her cheeks for color. She simply was. She washed her face and hands in the cool water of the basin, the simple act a kind of purification. She unpinned her long hair, letting it fall in a heavy curtain over her shoulders. She was dressed in a plain, homespun cotton dress, the fabric softened by countless washings. This was the woman he had seen weathered, but still standing. This was the woman he had chosen. She would meet him with nothing but the simple, unadorned truth of herself. She sat on the edge of her cot, her hands folded in her lap, and she listened to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night, the low voices of the men in the bunkhouse, the soft nicker of a horse in the corral, the lonely cry of a coyote far out on the plains. And she waited. This waiting was not the anxious, fretful waiting of her past. It was a patient, peaceful, and absolute certainty. He would come. The knock, when it finally sounded on her door, was so soft she almost thought she had imagined it. It was not the urgent summons of the night he'd needed another hand. It was not a demand for entry. It was a question, a gentle, respectful inquiry. She rose, her heart giving a single, powerful thrum against her ribs. She crossed the small room and pulled the door open. He stood on the other side of the threshold, a dark, solid shape against the deep, star-dusted velvet of the Wyoming night. The cool air swirled in around him, carrying the scent of pine and clean earth. The lantern light from within her cabin fell upon his face, softening the hard lines, illuminating the profound seriousness in his eyes. He did not step forward. He did not try to enter. He stood on the outside, his hat in his hands, his gaze holding hers. He waited. He had said he would. And Marshall Boone was a man who kept his word. He was giving her this last moment, this final boundary, to honor the choice he had placed so completely in her hands. The sight of his patient, unwavering respect was the most deeply romantic gesture she had ever known. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her gratitude. Love. a sense of homecoming so profound it was a physical ache in her chest. Slowly, she took a single step forward, closing the small space between the inside of her cabin and the outside world where he stood. She crossed the threshold herself, meeting him where he was. She raised her hand, the deerskin glove he had given her long since set aside, and laid her palm flat against the solid, warm wall of his chest. Through the rough fabric of his clean shirt, she could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart. It was beating as powerfully as her own. She looked up into his face, into the depths of his patient, waiting eyes, and she gave him her final answer, her last claim on her own terms. "Tomorrow," she whispered, the word a soft, intimate promise. A slow warmth spread across his face, a smile that was less a movement of his mouth and more a light that came from deep within his eyes. He raised his own hand and covered hers, his calloused fingers lacing through her own, holding her there, against his heart. "Then I'll wait," he answered, his voice a low, gravelly vow. But as she stepped back, she did not close the door. She left it open, a wide, welcoming path of light that cut through the darkness, connecting her small, safe world to his. It was an invitation, a promise that the boundary between them was gone forever. He stood for a moment longer, framed in the doorway, then gave her a final, slow nod before turning and disappearing into the night. Joanna remained in the open doorway, the cool air on her face, the warmth of his touch still lingering on her hand. She was not closing the door on the night, or on him, or on the beautiful, uncertain, and magnificent life that was about to begin. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to connect with our audience, so please let us know where you're listening from in the comments below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by many more.